Sorry, Francesca, for interrupting you. Okay, thank you very much, Francesca. I will now switch to Derek Bousè. He's the author of several wildlife films from University of Pennsylvania. And now, he's currently professor and dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the American University of Technology in Lebanon. So please, Derek, go ahead.
Hello, I'm happy to be with you. I'm going to talk about violence in the media, but since our subject here is violence in society, I'm a bit surprised that I haven't heard anyone mention so far Steven Pinker's thesis put forth in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which was published in 2011, I think. It's worth mentioning here. Pinker argues that we may now be living in the most peaceable era in the existence of our species. And he argues that past societies were much more violent than we realize. And today, the average person is far less likely than ever before to die violently or even to experience extreme violence. The historical transformation that he writes about, he argues, resulted from what he calls a civilizing process that combined enlightenment ideals, which was the subject of a subsequent book, with the rise of nation states that maintained monopoly on force. In other words, concentrating the use of force in the police rather than distributed throughout society. And he argues that the evolution from barbarism to civilization, as characterized by Hobbes in Leviathan, ushered in a major historical decline in violence. Now, you can see a similar theme, I suppose, in Francis Fukuyama's famous end of history thesis. And his idea there was that the disappearance of large, destructive, full-scale wars between nations of the sort we saw in the first half of the 20th century, that has ended. Although it should be said that there's been what seems to be a rise in non-combatant deaths, if recent events in Syria are any indication. Anyway, Pinker's thesis has been controversial. It's been disputed by the likes of Ed Herman, the late Edward Herman, and John Gray in the UK and others. But as I said, I want to talk about violence and the media. And when I say media, I don't mean social media, in which most of the content is user-generated, and therefore it's difficult to discern clear underlying patterns. I want to talk here briefly about media as traditional mass media, what are sometimes called legacy media. Media violence in this context is institutionalized, it's systematic, and it's pervasive. Just a little bit of note on background here. Media studies comes out of sociology, basically, but as you know, 50 years ago, there were some serious political assassinations in the United States, and that led the U.S. Congress to hold hearings and issue a massive report by the Surgeon General's office, one volume of which linked media violence directly to violent behavior in society. And this was seen as a public health hazard. Now, a number of theories have been put forth about the relationship of media violence and violent behavior or its reduction. One, of course, is catharsis theory, and this goes back to Aristotle's Poetics, the idea that a performance in those days, a dramatic performance, would evoke powerful emotions and then help people to purge them by a kind of vicarious experience. And that's the cathartic effect. Then another one that's widely subscribed to is social learning theory. This is sometimes called observational learning theory. This comes from Albert Bandura's research, which you may be familiar with. The idea here is that behavior is learned from observing others in our social environment who model behavior. So children observe adults who model behavior for them. And according to this theory, therefore, it matters who commits violence, whether it is rewarded or punished, whether it is socially approved, and whether it proves successful, because success inspires emulation. So typically in the media, good guys' violence is seen as just. And that, of course, would be more likely to be emulated by children and young people. In fact, this is kind of been a truism. If you go back to the Hollywood production code that was implemented in the 1930s, the early 1930s, written into the code were provisions that crime could not be shown in movies to be successful. The idea that crime doesn't pay was institutionalized in the code so that it didn't provide models, successful models for the citizens. Now, another theory is, try to cut this short, another one is desensitization theory. The idea that viewing media violence makes us less sensitive to it in our own environment and less sensitive to its consequences. A term sometimes used here is happy violence, meaning we watch violence in the movies, someone gets shot, they fall down, that's it. We don't see any consequences. We don't see the hospitalization, we don't see someone becoming a quadriplegic as a result, and the strain that puts on healthcare systems and families and so forth. It's just quick and clean, and it's over with. And so the idea is that makes us less sensitive. This idea that violence doesn't have consequences can make us less sensitive to it. And the last one I'll mention, and I should probably confess here, this research grew out of, this body of theory grew out of research done by some of my professors at Penn some years ago, is called cultivation theory. And this is an alternative view. If we look at social learning theory, the idea is that violent imagery can make people violent. Even if it's not copycat behavior, that's the title, social learning theory. People learn violence from others. Cultivation theory, as I say, is an alternative view. Now, I participated in this research when I was a student many years ago. We took a sample of television, primetime television, and then we spent the next year literally counting every act of violence and coding them. We had an elaborate code book, and we would code every act of violence and time them with a stopwatch, code them for severity. And we gathered a lot of data, huge data sets from all of this coding that we did. And from that, they developed a violence index. In other words, statistically, who on television is violent? Who commits violent acts the most often? What category of people? What's their profile? Whose use of violence is just? Who can get away with it? And who's likely to be victimized? In fact, symbolic violence reveals patterns of victimization. And you might not be surprised to learn that women and minorities are most likely to be the victims of violence on television. A term that came out of this research that gets used a lot is the mean world syndrome. The idea here is that violent media, unlike social learning theory, doesn't make people more violent. It makes them afraid. And frightened populations will accept tougher, more repressive laws. In fact, they'll even demand them because they're afraid. So if there's greater compliance, you'll have greater social controls and possibly the acceptance of oppression in the name of safety. And if you remember 20 years ago, after the famous 9/11 attacks in New York City, the refrain so often heard was, just keep us safe. And so the idea here is that long-term, longitudinal exposure to persistent violent acts on television over time makes people afraid, and rather than more violent. There are many more theories. I'm not going to go into them. My time is running short here, but I'll just say by way of conclusion that I joined with the calls in the United States for some years for greater media literacy. media literacy programs in schools to equip young people with the tools they need to resist the seductions of media that emphasize violent imagery. Recently, there's been some interesting research done at Yale suggesting that violence in society is driven by a sense of grievance. And we've certainly seen the politics of grievance in the United States in recent years. And the idea here is that the more aggrieved people feel, the more determined they are to use retaliation, to retaliate violently. Now, here's where traditional media and social media have something in common, because they both rely on grievance and revenge-based content to attract viewers, increase their advertising and sales. This research argues that retaliation in response to grievances is the primary motive in things like intimate partner violence, youth violence and bullying, street violence, lone actor attacks, stalkers, police brutality, and terrorism. And so they argue in this research that was done that people and agencies interested in reducing violence in society, especially murder rates, mass shootings, domestic terrorism, and other forms of violence, should be focusing on revenge addiction, and they use the language of addiction. That study, by the way, was called a pilot study for motive control to reduce vengeance cravings, and that was published 2 years ago in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law, I believe. If you want to contact me, I can send you the link to that. So again, by way of conclusion, I advocate better media literacy, and as this recent research suggests, some form of addressing this grievance addiction that seems to be fed by certain politicians. Well, thank you for your attention. I'll conclude there.